Good evening and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. I'm Rebecca Munro and this is Scotland at 7. Today I am joined with Siobhan Tolland and Ronnie Cowan MP. So Siobhan, how are you this evening?
Not too bad, Rebecca. Exciting times.
Of course, and Ronnie, how are you this evening?
I'm very well, thanks, Rebecca, and thanks for asking me in the programme again.
Lovely stuff. Well, we'll start with the coronavirus update and then we'll move on to the stories. So, as of 2 p.m. today, a total of 2,357,145 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and UK Government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 2,038,579 have been confirmed negative. 318,566 have tested positive. There are 2,529 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There are 4 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive, and the number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus 19 infection now stands at 7,761. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 506 were in hospital last night, 41 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. this morning, 3,941,571 people have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 2,903,557 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures show 128,481 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 50 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just hospitals. On to the ONS update. The percentage of people testing positive increased in England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland in the week ending the 3rd of July 2021. The most common variant across the UK is now the Delta variant. Hospital admissions of COVID-19 confirmed patients in England increased in the week ending the 4th of July. There were 109 deaths involving coronavirus registered in the week ending the 2nd of July 2021 in England and Wales, accounting for 1.2% of all deaths that week. In May, mortality rates due to COVID-19 decreased for the 4th consecutive month in both England and Wales. The proportion of deaths involving COVID-19 has decreased in those aged 75 years and over since January, likely reflecting age prioritisation in the vaccine programme. Now, on to our first story of this evening. First Minister's COVID statement. So at her COVID-19 briefing in Holyrood today, the First Minister advised that people should continue to follow public health measures to protect one another as all of Scotland prepares to move to level 0 at 1 minute past midnight on Monday the 19th of July. Confirming the change to level 0, Nicola Sturgeon urged people to adhere to protective measures and sensible precautions to suppress coronavirus to help create conditions that allow Scotland to move beyond level 0 on the 9th of August. From 1 minute past midnight on Monday the 19th of July, physical distancing in level 0 will reduce to 1 metre in all indoor public settings and outdoors. Additionally, informal social gatherings of up to 15 people from 15 households will be permitted outdoors without physical distancing. Gatherings of up to 10 people from 4 households will be permitted in all indoor public settings with 1 metre physical distancing. Other easings to level 0 taking effect at that time include under 12s will no longer count towards the number of households that can gather indoors in public spaces and homes. Hospitality settings can open till midnight if their current licence permits that, and customers will no longer be required to pre-book a 2-hour slot to go to a pub or restaurant, but will still be required to provide contact details to assist, test and protect. And up to 200 people will be able to gather at weddings and funerals. Employers are asked to continue to support home working where possible until we move beyond level 0. From 4 o'clock in the morning, Monday the 19th of July, travellers who are fully vaccinated through a UK vaccination programme and children arriving into Scotland from amber list countries will no longer be required to self-isolate and take a day 8 test. But adults and children over 12 will still take tests before travelling and on day 2 after travel. Anyone testing positive for or experiencing symptoms of COVID-19 will still require to isolate for 10 days. A survey is being launched for those at highest risk from COVID-19 to gather views on what additional support might be needed as restrictions ease. Later this week, the Chief Medical Officer will also write to this group with advice on what moving to level 0 will mean for them. The First Minister said that while Scotland will move to level 0 from next Monday, we will do so with certain modifications to our original indicative plans. This is intended to ensure that our pace of easing restrictions is sensible in light of the challenge we continue to face from the Delta variant. There is no doubt that Delta has become, unfortunately, something of a game changer, even for countries on course to achieving full vaccination protection. So COVID does remain a threat that we must treat seriously. So, Siobhan, do you think that the First Minister's kind of gradual approach to easing restrictions is an approach that will hold us in good stead?
It'll hold us in better stead than England, I think. I would have preferred a bit more caution, if I'm honest. I think that there's maybe two camps here. One that, glad that we're getting a little bit more freedom. But for me personally, as a shielder, I think that feels a wee bit like the safety net is kind of getting taken away. I get that she has been cautious, and I think that in comparison to Westminster approach, it is much more reasonable, much more sensible, much more based in a scientific approach. But the concern is, of course, is that the hospitals are still beginning to fill up, not necessarily because of kind of COVID infections as such, but because of absence rates in terms of hospitals, that it's causing more pressure. And then, of course, the hospitals are trying to get back to normal as well. So we're kind of fight on quite a few different levels within the NHS. I think the problem, of course, is that COVID is so unknown. And I can't remember who it was, but there was someone that said a few weeks ago, it's like, if you're driving 60 mile an hour and turning a very sharp bend, you decrease your speed because you don't know what's up ahead. And I do think that there's an element of that. Nicola Sturgeon's in a very, very difficult position. I think that the Scottish Government is, because it doesn't matter what decision it is, she's always going to be criticised from either side, isn't it? The Conservatives were criticising her for being too cautious, and here's me kind of saying, maybe a bit more caution is required. But, if in doubt, I think go with caution for sure. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. I'll wait for my letter from the Chief Medical Officer, see what he wants. And for me, I've been working from home for the last 18 months now, so I suppose it's the start of that journey to begin to move back into campus and stuff as well. We'll see what happens. I'm concerned because the COVID rates are going down, but the schools are off. So. What happens when the schools go back? We'll find out, I suppose.
Yes, I suppose there's no guarantees at the moment with COVID. And Ronnie, do you agree with the First Minister that the kind of gradual approach is also the sustainable approach, specifically in regards to the economy?
I agree with what Siobhan was saying there. I would have been happy to take it slower, but the First Minister has to look at the country and all aspects of it as a one and see what's the best for everybody. The COVID is we're still learning. And COVID it's a learning process that it will be until we've got it completely under control, whenever that will be. So decisions have to be made, which are hard decisions, which protect the majority of our population. The figures you gave us at the start of the programme, over 7,700 people have died in Scotland because of this disease. We should never forget that. That's what we're fighting against. And if we let this loose again, then those numbers will continue to increase and could increase at frightening rates. So we're in a situation now where we all want to over and done with, we all want to move on to that stage, we all want what Boris Johnson stupidly called a freedom day, where we think that's it, it's in the past, life goes on as normal. The First Minister's been much more measured in her approach than saying, it'll happen, we're going to work for it, we're going to be progressive, and at the same time, we have to take precautions to get us to where we want to be, which is a completely COVID-free country. And if that's possible, because we're hearing that the booster giants will be available sometime in the autumn, and it could be something which we've got to live with within our society forever now. So at this stage of the game, we're taking a measured approach, and I can understand what the FM's doing. And as Siobhan said, I'd rather be doing what we're doing here in Scotland than what Boris is trying to do in England right now.
Yes, because of course, where Nicola Sturgeon said that she was moving at a responsible rate, the Prime Minister's going at a much faster rate. And then, Siobhan, do you think that his decision will actually affect the number of COVID cases up here in Scotland, despite the fact that we're going slightly slower with less restrictions?
I think it will. I mean, it's inevitable. Devi Schreeder said quite a few months back that if you think about the kind of four-nation approach, it's kind of for Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, it's kind of like being on a carriage on a very fast train. There's very little control you have, when one of the larger nation is controlling that process. Yes, of course it was. Of course it will. I mean, the movement between the borders. I mean, I've never seen my sister for over 2 years. She's coming up to Dundee, hopefully, in a couple of weeks. So there's going to be that movement there. I think that notion of England increasing is just going to spread out across. I mean, across the UK, the Delta variant is incredibly infectious. It's extraordinarily reckless, I think, of the Westminster government to do this, because it raises these expectations of there is no need for precaution, there is no need for safety measures, and I think that's where Nicola Sturgeon's message has always been much more clear and much more on point and much more grown up in its response. So yeah, we will always be we will always have the effects of a bad decision when it comes to COVID.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, even Boris Johnson himself has kind of started to use some slightly more cautious language when talking about his restrictions. So, Ronnie, I was thinking, if COVID cases decide to, well, not decide, but if they do start increasing, do you think Boris Johnson would consider going back into a full lockdown?
Well, Boris will flip-flop this as he's told to do. One moment he's doing very heroic things, and his view heroic is all Rule Britannia, we're going to press on with this and we're going to have this done by, was it last Christmas he said it was going to be over and done by? And then he gets more advice, he backs off a little bit, we don't see him in the media for a while. And Boris is a front man for the Conservative government trying to hang on right now. And once it's over and done with, he'll get ripped down and replaced by, well, at this stage, last man standing, the way things are looking. So when Boris Johnson is somebody who's rolled out to tell us all that everything's fantastic, everything's wonderful, everything's going to be under control until it isn't, and then he sort of mumbles things about opportunities and lost opportunities and what we've all got to do, and it's the same rhetoric from Boris. You just don't find there's anything serious behind it, any substantive that you can hang your hat on and say this guy is making tough decisions, because he isn't. He will blow with the wind. He'll blow with the wind at every opportunity for whatever he thinks makes him popular, and that's his entire mantra. That's entirely what drives Boris Johnson. What can I say that will make me popular? And if it's to say everything's okay, everything's back to normal, then that's what he's going to say. But if there's a huge increase of people saying we've got to take precautions, we've got to clamp down, that's what Boris will say. He's been driven by it instead of leading it.
Yeah, and do you think it is the popular opinion for people? Do they want to see restrictions? Like, I mean, obviously it'd be nice to go out and, go back to our normality in our daily lives, but realistically, is it actually what people want?
Well, I think you're right. People do want, of course we want it, but we want it in a responsible manner. I mean, as soon as I'm into trouble for this, as soon as the announcements were made this afternoon, my kids started sending me messages because it says 8 people from 4 households meet indoors. So it's great, yours for tea, Dad. So suddenly I'm going to be catering for my 3 kids and their partners all over again, which will be fantastic. That's what we want. But if we think that by doing that, we're going to make life harder for people who are shielding, people who are isolating, then we have to take a responsible attitude to the society around us and say, that would be great. Of course we want that. Of course we want it. But if we have to put it off for a couple of months, then that's what we have to do.
Brilliant, thanks Ronnie. We'll move on to the next story of today, which is Greensill inquiry. So the former head of propriety and ethics in the Cabinet Office, Sue Gray, was intended to be questioned this morning as part of an inquiry into propriety of governance in the light of Greensill. However, this session was cancelled after Michael Gove blocked the committee's access to Gray's evidence. Greensill, specialising in supply chain finance, was set up by Lex Greensill. David Cameron was the Conservative Prime Minister when Greensill began to procure lucrative government documents. In 2016, after his resignation, David Cameron became a highly paid advisor to Greensill and was also the recipient of share options worth millions. There is still inquiring to be done on how Greensill became so embedded with Cameron's Downing Street and why the government, which does not have a cash flow problem, needed to use supply chain finance. Now, Ronnie, I'm going to come to you for a few of these questions, as you are the expert in this. So, would you be able to just refresh your memories on the salient facts surrounding Greensill scandal and I suppose the kind of need and importance of the COVID corporate financing facility loans at the beginning of the pandemic?
The whole issue around Greensill and Lex Greensill is the problems we're facing now is a lack of transparency at the time. And now as we look back and say, well, why did that happen? Why was that decision made? We're trying to find the information now. And you only ever try to do this so as you don't make the same mistake again. That's the purpose of a select committee. We hold, in my situation, public administration and constitution to account to make sure that if things have gone wrong, they don't go wrong again. So this is public administration. So we look at something like Greensill and say, this wasn't very clever, what do we do to make it better? We need the facts. So we bring people in front of us to give evidence. And the select committee, well, David Cameron appeared in front of a select committee. Almost everybody I know that has ever been asked to appear in front of a select committee has appeared in front of a select committee. From current Prime Ministers to previous Prime Ministers to Cabinet Ministers to the heads of the civil servants. If a select committee says, come and give us the evidence, they will come. Now they're briefed within an inch of their life. And some are consummate at giving evidence and talking for hours and not actually telling anything. That's the job of the select committee, to dig in there and try and wink out a few facts from them. Michael Gove has refused to come in front of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Select Committee, called PACAC, 2-3 times now. And then when he did come along, he sat down and said, I've only got an hour and then I've got to go somewhere else. Which is just not how you treat the system. We asked Sue Gray to come in front of us to give evidence because she was in situ at the time back in 2012 to 2018 when a lot of this was happening. And Sue Gray, top civil servant, said, yeah, I will, because I've been asked to. That's the way it goes. And Michael Gove, yesterday morning I got a message saying select committee Tuesday morning has been cancelled because Sue Gray has been told she cannot come and give evidence. Michael Gove offered to come in her place. That's ridiculous. Michael Gove doesn't know the answers to the questions we were going to ask Sue Gray. He doesn't even know what the questions were going to be. So he was going to come and do his usual, play a straight bat and say, well, we came in front of the committee and we've done our job and then that's all we're done with. Let's move on. Nothing to see here, let's move on. Sue Gray knows what happened back in those days. And in front of the select committee, she would have told us. So she's effectively been gagged, so we cannot find out. Now this is the inner workings of the Cabinet Office in number 10 Downing Street and how they procure contracts, how they handle the public's money, and how people get appointed to positions. When Lex Greensill was appointed as a consultant, had he been a contractor, I think the phrase would be, his contract would have been different. If you work within a Cabinet Office in certain positions, but not as a contractor, when you leave that job, you cannot use the knowledge of garnished or the contacts you've garnished gathered during that time for your own financial benefits. If you're an MP or PM and you leave, you go through a thing called ACOBA, which is a committee which says you cannot take on that job because you were Secretary of State for Transport. So you cannot go and take a job with Network Rail because you've got inside knowledge of long-term planning. You cannot do that. These sort of things. But because Lex Greensill was employed as a contractor, he doesn't fall under any of that. So who made the decision that he could be a contractor? And then later on we found out that the Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, is now today working for organisations that are paying him $1 million a year to try and help smooth the way, make it easier for them to find the contacts to get big, seriously big money contracts for United Kingdom government. And all the sleaze behind this will slowly come to the surface, it always does. But right now the government don't want to talk about it. So what they're doing is they're closing down the mechanics and the machinery of the select committee process, which is there in place to hold government to account. And it's a terrible situation because continually we find when we crack that surface, we find out what's underneath is that there's cronyism and there's contracts, but we know the contracts handled through PPE, but this goes back to 2012. So we really want to know what was put in place then and who's responsible for doing it. And as I said at the beginning, just to make sure this doesn't happen again. And they wouldn't let us, probably the most important witness that we could bring in front of us, they have gagged her from coming in front of the committee.
Yeah, and you mentioned it being an administration issue. And I was just thinking, I mean, the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee have been dubbed as the AC-12 of Whitehall after the TV series Line of Duty. I mean, do you feel like your investigation has been deliberately obstructed by Whitehall insiders?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question about it. Yes, we like being considered, we like being compared to AC-12. So that's our job. Our job is to hold. We talk about administration. We talk about things like the ombudsman. We talk about the cabinet office. We talk about the civil service. It's that Whitehall. It's what the living, breathing heart of the administration behind everything that happens in the political front is part of what we're supposed to be looking after and holding to task. And I said, I'm not trying to do it in a vindictive way. We're simply trying to say, can we make this better? We're constantly doing that. And absolutely, if we cannot get people in the know to come in front of us and give evidence on matters which are hugely important to good governance and propriety of the UK government, then absolutely Sue Gray's been gagged and we've been blocked in our investigation.
Yeah, and then Siobhan, I mean, how can democracy then be taken seriously if parliamentary committees are denied access to key witnesses?
Exactly, and this is it. If we were talking about this incident in terms of Russia or Cuba or China or any other country across the globe, we would be sitting here talking about language like tin pot dictatorships, etc., etc. Effectively, what's happening here is basically Westminster, and Michael Gove in particular, is saying we are above scrutiny, and this is not the first time that this has happened. This is continuous, and I keep coming back to this. Remember when Brexit happened, and remember when the Conservative government got in, they tried to pass through the legislation for Brexit without public or even parliamentary scrutiny. That is where their kind of politics and their lack of democracy lies. Scrutiny is something that this structure no longer feels it requires anymore, and is, I was saying, it's constant obstruction to just try and find the truth. It's not surprising. It's mired in corruption. It's practically tin pot dictator stuff. It's basically, we can do what we want and we will not be held to account. That is the message that Michael Gove has given over the last couple of days. It's disgraceful. It really is absolutely disgraceful. There needs to be mechanisms, and when we become independent, we really need to start thinking about what anti-corruption procedures and how that works within a parliamentary and public life as well, because we could do so much better than this. We need a government that's held to account. That is the fundamental basics for democracy.
Yeah, definitely. And then surely, Ronnie, as Siobhan says, I mean, there has to be some sort of robust legal framework kind of drawn up, I suppose, to kind of halt a relationship between Whitehall and private companies benefiting from, lucrative government contracts, surely.
Well, I tend to think if everything's done in the open and it's transparent, then we don't have to worry about that. If it's done openly and honestly, then people at the time would know. If I had a pal who could supply the government with PPE equipment, and I was in a position to help him do that, but I knew that his stuff was absolutely the best. This guy's been doing it for 20, 30 years as a specialist subject, then I can turn and say, well, I happen to know this guy, and he's brilliant at his job, and he's bang on price, and he's employing all these people in the UK. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, just because I happen to know the guy. If I give him a wee phone call and say, by the way, these contacts are coming along and they're worth a fortune, you should maybe chuck in there, and I don't declare that, that's the problem. No one's trying to say that some companies who've got these contacts, some of them, but a fewer number than we'd like, actually did a decent job. But it's all the other ones on the side where it was a phone call to a mate type thing, It's really hard to put that into legislation, but If the conversations were held in the public eye and we said we're talking to these companies, then we can't have a problem with that, because at that point you can then challenge and say, why are you giving this contact to the guy that owns your local pub? Which is actually what happened. Why are you giving that contact to your family business that your sister still owns and you're a shareholder in it? And the fact that they did not declare this openly at the time is, to me, proof positive that they knew they were getting involved in dodgy dealings. If it was up there and open and transparent, then everybody would be able to see. It's very important that we see the machinery of government in action.
And just the final question on this subject then, Ronnie, how do you, as a member of a parliamentary committee, counteract obstructions like the one that Michael Gove's created just now?
Almost by naming and shaming. People have to understand that, if he's got nothing to hide, he would come in front of that committee and tell us what happened when we asked him the question. He didn't do that. If he's got nothing to hide, he would not be blocking Sue Gray from coming to this committee. So the more he blocks it, the more the question becomes, what is it you're trying to hide? It's a simple administrative thing. It's not a case of, we made that decision at the time, and with hindsight we'd all do things better. The more he blocks this, the more we think there's something very serious behind this, which we're not getting privy to. And we will continue to push. The thing is that the chair of the committee, William Wright, is a Conservative MP, and he's very strong on this. He's absolutely adamant that we will get Sue Gray in front of us at some point. And beyond that, other witnesses as well who can tell us what was happening in the day-to-day working environment inside Number 10 Downing Street, inside the Cabinet Office, when these decisions were being made. And I have to say, the Select Committee is cross-party. It's a Conservative-led committee. There's Labour members on it, and no Lib Dems. So it's Labour, Conservative, and me. And we do push forward inquiries in a very collegiate fashion. Occasionally, politics rears its head, of course it does. But in this matter, we want to make sure the UK government, which we're all elected to work within, is doing its job in the correct manner. So the committee will keep on pushing for this. And I've got every faith that the Conservative leader of my Select Committee, William Wright, is as keen to find the truth out as I am.
Brilliant. Well, we'll move on to the next story. So the next story is that Tyrone Mings calls out Priti Patel's hypocrisy. England footballer Tyrone Mings has criticised Home Secretary Priti Patel over her statement condemning the racist abuse faced by his teammates, despite her having called players taking the knee gesture politics. A number of politicians have tweeted support for England players Marcus Rashford, Jadon Sancho and Bukayo Saka, who faced a torrent of racism on social media after England's defeat in the Euro 2020 final. Mings said Patel had stoked the fire after she previously refused to criticise fans who booed the team for taking the knee in protest against racial injustice. He said, "You don't get to stoke the fire at the beginning of the tournament by labelling our anti-racism message as gesture politics, and then pretend to be disgusted when the very thing we're campaigning against happens." Responding to the racial abuse he and his England teammates had received, Marcus Rashford said, "I can take critique of my performance all day long. My penalty was not good enough, it should have gone in. But I will never apologise for who I am and where I came from." Now, Siobhan, do you think Mings was right in his criticism of Priti Patel? How did you react?
Absolutely was he right, and she had to be called out, and good for him for calling out, because it needs to be done. There needs to be more of that happening now. Priti Patel is, she's the one that's responsible for the hostile environment. You know what I mean? It's like she's bringing in what the Red Cross calls is inhumane legislation for asylum seekers. You don't do things like that and think that it's somehow going to be separate from the rest of society. When you create a hostile environment in a Home Office, you begin to create a hostile environment across the country, culturally, politically and socially. What's happening, these racist sentiments, they were vile, they were horrible against these black players, basically for doing something that anybody else could have done. That is being stoked. He's absolutely right. It's been stoked by people like Priti Patel, and you don't get to set the house on fire and then look on disgusted and horrified and going, "Oh, Jesus, isn't that terrible?" We need more challenges to Priti Patel, because actually what's happening here is a genuine kind of dehumanisation of our kind of vulnerable people and our BAME communities, and it really has to stop. It's symptomatic of, I think, what's happening down in England, and Westminster's feeding that. They're defining that. They're beginning to, and they're allowing racism to be open these days. And you can't just talk about jester politics. Her response to it was incredibly shallow, incredibly vacant, especially when she was kind of, I mean, this is these players were booed for giving an anti-racist message, and then she comes out and says, oh, it's gesture politics. Well, where does that tells you exactly where she stands? So good on him, good on him. It needs to be challenged much more. I would have gone a lot further, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been controversy over this concept of gesture politics. So, Ronnie, I mean, what actually is gesture politics? I mean, do you believe in this concept yourself?
I hope we don't practice it. Yeah, I mean, you can see the point where people jump on something and they make us a stance for it, but it's not heartfelt, and that's what Priti Patel was pretty much accusing them of, which is absolute nonsense. I've got to be very careful what I say about Priti Patel. As a woman, as an immigrant to this country, she's pulled the ladder up behind herself, and she's done nothing to further the cause of immigrations or a more welcoming, open society in the United Kingdom. And I think it's quite disgusting. To be criticised for what she said, absolutely. She's always taken the easy line on this, as in she hasn't stood up for minorities, she hasn't stood up for immigration. Yeah, look at the woman's career, and to be criticised, the criticism she received today, is absolutely correct. She has failed to support how many thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who have come from backgrounds like hers, and she took the opportunity to come to this country, I think from Uganda originally, and make something of her life here. And she's denied that opportunity to hundreds of thousands of people over the years, from the situation we had with trying to repatriate people from the centres that we put immigrants into. It's like every single step of the way she's shown herself to be certainly not as understanding and compassionate and humane as Marcus Rashford has been. Yeah.
Yeah, and Siobhan, I mean, Priti Patel called taking the knee an act of gesture politics. Do you think she would also consider clapping for the NHS during COVID gesture politics too?
Therein lies your irony, isn't it? Gesture politics is okay if they agree with it. I mean, when it comes down to it, politicians encouraging these things it does kind of create a kind of bit of a shallow resonance. But you are just talking about kind of ordinary cultural people here that wanted to do something public and something, and what they felt was important. And to dismiss it as gesture politics, I think was still. I mean, the term gesture politics is deliberately designed to demean the act, isn't it? Whether we agree with that definition or not, but that very concept and to say it against the booing as well, I think was particularly bad. But yeah, I mean, talk about the shallow claps when you get 1% pay rise, eh?
Exactly. Well, we'll move on to the next story of this evening, and that is that the House of Commons votes to keep cuts to international aid. The UK government will go ahead with its cuts to the international aid budget after the government won a vote in the House of Commons by 333 to 298 on the proposal to cut the minimum spend of overseas development to 0.5% of economic output. The cut was first announced in November as a measure to help pay for the COVID-19 pandemic. The government persuaded a sufficient number of party members to back the plan in the face of a possible Tory rebellion, which threatened to inflict an embarrassing defeat. SNP MP Chris Law had challenged Scottish Tory MPs to find a backbone and vote with Scotland, not Boris Johnson, and called for United Front to defeat government plans to break the UK's legal and moral commitment to spend 0.7% of GNI on international aid. So, Ronnie, do you agree with the results of today's vote?
to agree with the results. I've seen the results. It's an absolute abomination. This goes back to when the government it merged, or the Department for International Development was taken under the jurisdiction of the Foreign Office, and almost in the back of that, they announced £4 billion in cuts to aid. So we can see what path they were on. Yeah, it's been condemned widely by the people on the ground, by the charities that work in some of the most impoverished countries in the world. And they know what that money means, they know what they can do with it on a daily basis. And some of the stories that are coming back now, I mean, the Yemen is facing one of its worst famines in living memory. And that will, so these cuts will directly kill people. It's really as simple as that. People will die as a result of that vote today in the House of Commons because it went in favour of these cuts. Save the Children have said that they will close 17 healthcare facilities. 15,000 kids who have been protected won't be protected. And we're seeing that there's a big number. That big number equates down to individual organisations, and some of them will have a smaller cut than others, but some of them are going to be almost completely wiped out. The global polio eradication initiative are going to lose 95% of their funding. How can that organisation exist? So what we're going to do? We're going to see polio emerging again through third world nations. I mean, that's the effect of what's happened today in the House of Commons. So in there, it'll be a very dry affair. We have a bit of emotion getting thrown about. But at the end of the day, you can't just look at a count and say, well, the government got this through by 35 votes, and that's it done and dusted. The result of that is directly people will suffer. The most poorest, most impoverished people, most displaced people will suffer because of this, and people will die because of this. And the Conservatives and Unions voted for that today.
Yeah, and the UK had the second highest contribution as a percentage of GNI of the G7 group representing the world's leading economies, Siobhan. And I mean, I feel like that's something to be quite proud of. And yet, why have we voted today to cut international aid when, as Ronnie says, that so many people are going to die and be affected by this?
Well, for exactly the same reason that they decided to initiate the austerity agenda. I think that, I mean, the excuse that Boris Johnson has given is that we're debt is now 100% of our GDP and so on, so we have to make these cuts. These are ideological. These are not necessary cuts. After the Second World War, we were sitting at 250% in terms of debt, in terms of our GDP. We're nowhere near that situation now. And look what the Labour Party did after the war. They built themselves out of debt. They invested in infrastructure. They invested in people. They invested in the health and well-being of their people, and that was what got us out of this mess. Now, when the crash happened in 2008, what happened is we had the austerity agenda. We were told that we all had to tighten our belts and we all had to make cuts. These cuts were never necessary. They were ideological cuts. That's what it was. It was an excuse to basically take away those welfare structures and actually punish people who were disabled and poor and vulnerable. And what they're actually doing now, they've been itching to do this for many, many years now. They're doing it now on an international level. And as Ronnie said, the consequences of this is actually extraordinarily desperate. It looks like a small cut, 0.7% to 0.5%. Well, it doesn't look that much. It's actually about a 28% cut in real terms. It's gone from about 14 billion to 10 billion. And as Yanis Varoufakis said on Question Time the other week, it's one thing not giving that money. It's an entirely different thing. Taking that money away from existing organisations, existing aid organisations that actually work to the welfare and well-being of the world's population. And if we look at it, even taking away the morality and ethics of that, because it is completely immoral in my opinion, it will come back to haunt us tenfold across the globe, because what will happen is it will create hundreds more problems because of, as Ronnie was talking about, the polio issue is going to cause massive problems for the globe. We should be thinking about a global welfare agreement here, not drawing the rug from under the most vulnerable people because we think that we've spent a wee bit more money. we've been printing money like you wouldn't believe. Do you know what I mean? It's possible. It's possible we can do it. These are ideological decisions, and it fits in with a hostile environment. They're not disconnected. They're not disconnected. This is part of a dehumanisation, empire-esque type structure where the UK sits above the globe, better than, and no one else matters. It's a very insular way, and it's a very it's actually a racist way of looking at things as well. I agree with Ronnie. I don't get hugely angry a lot of the times because I think there's too much anger going on in politics, but this one really gets to me actually because it's just so awful. And it is, and sorry, just one final point, but I really do need to keep repeating the point that these are ideological cuts. These are not necessities. We are sacrificing people's health and well-being across the globe just because we want to. That's not appropriate. It's not good enough.
No, it's quite baffling. Yeah, no, definitely. Anyway, we'll have to move on to our next story, which is the Cabinet Office appeal secret union polling. The SNP has slammed the UK government's decision to appeal a ruling which would see them disclose information about secret polling conducted on public attitudes to the union during the pandemic. The first-tier tribunal information rights ruled last month that the information requested by SNP MP Tommy Sheppard relates to the implementation of existing policy rather than to policy development, and as a result, the Cabinet Office were ordered to disclose the information within 28 days. The SNP has called for a full public inquiry into the revelation that the UK government used funds for COVID contracts to conduct research related to constitutional issues. The SNP's Constitutional Affairs spokesperson, Tommy Sheppard MP, said that it has now been 28 days since the tribunal ruled that the information requested must be made public. But as yet, he has not received any information or update from the Cabinet Office. Mr Sheppard said that emergency COVID contracts were supposed to be used for things like PPE or for our doctors and nurses fighting COVID. I suppose the real question here, Ronnie, is why are they conducting secret polling? Why is it being kept a secret?
As I understand it, the ruling around polling is if I commission somebody to run a poll for me, and I get that information that tells me, what they intend to vote or what they think about any given issue or what food they feed their cat, or that's my information. I paid for that. If I then use that information, if I start campaigning the back of it, then I have to share the information within that poll. So as a political party, as an individual, I can buy in a polling information that gives me more knowledge. But if I start using that publicly and say, this is a fact, 80% of people want this, then I've got to prove that by publishing the poll. So the Conservative government, the Conservative Party, can poll as much as they like and not tell us. But what the government can't do is use public money to poll on subject matter and then not disclose that information. It comes back to why are they not telling us? So they've run this poll, and we said, oh, we know you've run this poll, you tried to do it secretly, you used dubious money to do it as far as we think the money should not have been used for this purpose in the first place. So tell us what you're polling, tell us the results, and tell us why you used that money. And they went, no, we're not doing any of that. And then as you said, they were told in the first tier tribunal, yes, you have to. You have to publish this, and you've got 28 days to do it. And they've now run down the clock, and at the last minute they put an appeal to it. So it goes back to what we were talking about earlier on. What are they hiding? And it just looks so bad. It really does look like the government don't want to be scrutinised, they don't want to be held to account by the people who elected them or didn't elect them. And that's a bad look for any government anywhere to have. So again, because they've said no, the interest in what that polling shows will increase and increase and increase until they tell us. The fact of the matter is, private polling using public money by a government is not a good thing to be doing.
Yeah, and Siobhan, I mean, can we start to possibly draw conclusions from this poll due to their determination of hiding it?
Well, we know it's not going to be good for the union, do we? And it is one of those things, isn't it? It's like what Ronnie was saying earlier on, the more they hide it, the more you think, what's going on, And so in a way, it's very counterproductive. They're just actually drawing attention to the fact that they're trying to hide something, isn't it? It's not a good look. And the people of Scotland are watching this. To be honest with you, anybody that's kind of looking at things like the social attitude survey or kind of some kind of polling, we kind of probably can guess what's going on. Scottish people don't trust the UK government as far as they can throw them. And it's probably a kind of, digging a little bit deeper, that's probably what they're finding. But there'll be nuggets there, as Ronnie was saying, that's probably the union unit is probably pouring over as we speak, you know. But yes, I mean, it's basic democracy, isn't it? You know, the more they hide it, the more I'm desperate to know what it says. The only issue is it might be something very small, and we'll all be like, "Oh, right, is that? Is that what they were hiding?"
We might be very underwhelmed by this one.
Yes, exactly.
Anyway, we'll have to move on to the next story, which is the Afghan security forces collapse. And that's large parts of Afghanistan, including those remote outposts and many more, have fallen to the Taliban, and thousands of soldiers have fled the country or surrendered to the militants, handing over their equipment and weapons. Instead of the Afghan security forces retrenching and consolidating positions, there has been collapse, and intelligence agencies have ripped up their assessments of the strength of the Afghan military. The US now fears Kabul could fall within months. In desperation to stem the losses, the government has urged warlords and regional strongmen to call up militias that fought the Taliban, but also each other during the all-out civil war of the 1990s. As recently as last year, Ghani had been trying to disband these groups. Today, France has called on all its citizens in Afghanistan to leave the country over the growing security concerns, according to a statement from the French embassy in Kabul. The Taliban are pressing on with a blistering offence while foreign forces are completing their withdrawal. So, Ronnie, did you think that when we first went into Afghanistan that we would be here now in this situation 20 years later?
No foreign government, no foreign country has ever won a war in Afghanistan, ever. Yeah, their attitude towards it is different from ours. I heard a story at the beginning where, when initially the US forces, the British forces that were there as well, were saying, "Oh, we'll be here for as long as it takes. We'll be here for 5 years, 10 years." And the Afghan response, or the Taliban response, was, "We'll be here for generations. This is our land. We'll be here 100 years from now, 200 years from now, 1,000 years. This is our land. We're not going anywhere." You know, remember, they fought against Russia years before that, and won. They just dug in and just the time, the winters, wore down the enemy. So, but the bigger picture to me is not who's going to win a war. It's why are we continuing to wage war in Afghanistan? If we were to, before we talked about cutting foreign aid, if we were to invest in a country of Afghanistan, which has got great riches and great potential, and if we were to help them with education and health and transport and build them a country worth living for, then they could run their own country. We shouldn't be in there telling them what they can and cannot do. And if you do these things by helping a country off its knees so it can fulfill its potential, the likelihood of what are primarily poor young men getting involved in civil wars reduces. We have to fight the problem here, and the part of the problem is poverty, and it's poverty which we have forced upon Afghanistan through all the wars which different countries have waged over Afghanistan, over their territories for hundreds of years now, and we've still not got it right. And because of the abilities and the durability of their own resistance, we're not going to win a land war in Afghanistan, because it's their land and they will dig it out for generations, and we cannot get involved. We've already proved to ourselves we cannot do this, so we should try a different tact. We should be helping Afghanistan with all this foreign aid which we're cutting, and give people better lives, and that's how you keep peace in a region.
Yeah, of course, and Afghanistan's wars have been going on now for over 40 years. And Siobhan, not that you're obviously a fortune teller, but if you were, do you think this situation very quickly will ever rectify itself?
I wish I had the power of the see the future. Not for as long. I think the problem is that as long as the kind of empire countries see other countries as assets, and not countries, as Ronnie was saying, with people, with poverty, with hopes, with fears, with with the kind of ordinary everyday issues that countries face, then we're always going to have these type of problems. It requires a very, very different international, non-empire-esque attitude towards countries. The only way we can, you don't prevent war by, as Ronnie says, I can't echo what Ronnie says enough, actually. You don't prevent wars by kind of stomping in and saying this is what you should do. I mean, Britain's got a history of doing that across the globe, and it's never worked, I wish I could see a resolution, but the interference sometimes is so deep. It's so deep now that it's hard to find a resolution. It really is. But as Ronnie said, I think we need to learn the lessons of the fact that we think we know best all the time. And that we can go in and lecture other countries on what they should do best. A country knows what's best for itself, and and that comes from kind of issues of Scottish self-determination to Afghanistan to Iraq. We need to really, really learn those lessons. Unfortunately, I don't think Britain ever will.
Yes, so we will move on to the next story, which is that 45 are dead in South African unrest. The unrest in South Africa, triggered by the jailing of the former president Jacob Zuma, has intensified, despite calls for calm from senior officials and the deployment of thousands of soldiers to the streets to reinforce struggling police. President Cyril Ramaphosa has described the deadly violence and protests as unprecedented in the 27 years since the end of the apartheid regime. The death toll from nearly a week of unrest has risen to 45, some from gunshot wounds, while 750 people have been arrested. 10 people were killed during a crowd crush on Monday night, officials said. And separately, a 15-year-old boy was killed when he was shot in the chest with a rubber bullet. Local media reported 4 police officers have been injured. I mean, Ronnie, this is obviously dreadful that this many people have died, and Zuma's foundation have said that there would be no peace in South Africa until the former president was released from jail. Do you think that this is an accurate assumption?
I think almost your first part of the sentence is correct. There will be no peace in South Africa. And it follows on from the Afghan story. And this is the first. You said the Afghan war began for 40 years. Britain invaded Afghanistan in 1839, where we were the imperial power in India. And not long after that, I'm going to say 1870s, we invaded Africa. And we raped that countryside. We took all its value from it, and we left it impoverished. And almost 100 years later, 100 years later, we're seeing the outcome of that. Countries which were not left to develop their own forms of democracy, their own institutions, their own education systems, their own cultures that were suppressed for all these years, have struggled for many, many years to move into a modern world. And South Africa is doing that now in the same way as Afghanistan is. And the root cause of it is the way those countries were used and abused by primarily European countries throughout the 19th century, or late 19th century. So the situation in South Africa right now, I'm of a generation where I've quick glance over to my book. I've got Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom, and I honestly hoped on that great day when he was released from prison that South Africa would be looking forward to a much brighter future. But the problems within their society are so deep and so brutal that it's going to take a longer time for them to get there. And again, what we should be doing is helping them, but as Siobhan pointed out, not in this we know better attitude. We tried that, we clearly didn't. We've damaged more countries than we've ever helped. So we're in a situation now where we have to be able to say in some way, shape, or form, how can we help South Africa? How can we help the poor people of South Africa? Because again, this goes out of poverty. If you look at the people who have been shot dead, it's not really the people in the rich suburbs. It's the poorest people in South Africa who have been shot by the police, which is a story we've been telling for a long, long time. And I don't know the way of this one. I don't know enough about South African politics, but I know the root cause of it is the fact that they have been subjugated by imperialism and held down by poverty for all these years.
Yeah, there's a kind of theme running in today's, that's help each other. It seems to be the theme of today's stories. Anyway, we will move on, and that our next story is that Schumer wants to bring voting legislation back to Senate floor. President Biden visited Philadelphia today to issue a strong appeal for support for voting rights legislation that has been blocked in Congress by the Republican opposition. About a dozen Republican-controlled states have approved laws that either restrict voting or change election rules, using ex-President Trump's 2020 defeat as an excuse for the reforms. While the president's voting rights legislation faces an uphill battle in Congress, his focus on it allows him to rally support among Democratic voters, as US Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said today that he reserves the right to bring voting legislation back to the Senate floor, despite Republicans voting to prevent it from being debated last month. Siobhan, why are they? I mean, surely you want it to be as easy as possible for people to vote. So why are we restricting? Why are they wanting to put restrictions on the ease of voting?
Because it's the US and they're going through a very Trumpian era. I mean, it's like, we are talking about, we are talking about another empire. We are talking about a country that's based on slavery, and we are talking about a country that's fought against the franchise for certainly the Black community for many, many decades. And this is a kind of backlash against that. There's been attempts to suppress voter rights for decades. When slaves were freed, then the Ku Klux Klan came into force and basically just ruled by violence. There's constant backlash against rights for the Black communities within America and other communities as well, the poor communities also. But yes, it's a classic tactic, isn't it, to kind of try and suppress voter rights and keep the power in the white and the privileged and the powerful. Every time I get asked about Biden, it always just feels like he's cleaning up Donald Trump's mess. But Donald Trump might be gone, but the shock waves that he initiated and kind of allowed are still happening within the United States. Using conspiracy as a way of doing it. It's a classic right-wing Trumpian tactic, actually. And I hope they do change it.
Sadly, we are now going to have to move on to our last story of this evening. So the launch of the Vehicle Crime Awareness Campaign, and that is that Police Scotland has launched an awareness-raising campaign to prevent vehicles being targeted by criminals. During the past year, when the country was subject to a range of coronavirus restrictions, including lockdown, recorded crime fell. As crime rates return to pre-COVID levels, officers are seeing a rise in the number of cars, vans and motorcycles being stolen or having items stolen from within. Attempted theft of vehicles has increased across Scotland, and in a number of divisions there has been an increase in the number of vehicles successfully stolen too. So, Ronnie, is this something that you come across often in Inverclyde?
Get me into trouble with that. do we have crime in Inverclyde? Yeah, okay.
I'll ask Siobhan the same question about Dundee.
Dundee. Well, I can answer for Dundee as well. Yeah, of course. And during lockdown, you're right, crime dropped. Great thing, pollution dropped. It was the benefits of COVID. Who would have thought it? So if the police are saying now, we're going to be careful what we're doing here, and I don't want to come over as been too soft on crime. I'm not soft on crime. If someone stole my car, I'd be absolutely furious. It's not just the loss of the car; it's the contents in it, it's the inconvenience of not having it. It's the feeling that you've been wronged. So, but we have to get this into perspective, I think, and why are people involved in so much crime? And we have to address that as well. And I say that I'm trying not to get involved in gesture politics here, because if someone stole my car, I'd be really, really annoyed. I know he would be. I understand that. But if we're going to learn lessons from COVID, it's that sometimes crime drops. So what happened during COVID? Was it just the logistics of people not being out in the streets to actually go stealing cars? Was the need less during COVID? What happened? What happened during COVID that crime dropped? And how can we not sustain that out of COVID, rather than immediately jumping on the idea that these figures are going to increase? If the police are saying the figures are increasing, the police are there to enforce the law and are in a very difficult situation that we sometimes make pretty bad laws, and they've got to enforce them. But if people are stealing more cars, then the police have got to get in amongst those communities and find out what they can do to head off at the pass and give kids, it's primarily kids, better things to do with their lives than get involved in crime at an early age. So we have to look at the communities and say, what were you doing during COVID? We just not got out as much. What can we do to fill your free time now that you are out and about to lead you away from the path of stealing cars? If we just lock people up for stealing cars, then we're throwing them into prisons, and the situation just gets worse and worse and worse. So I'm hoping that we can look at the situation and say, those people who are now apparently out there stealing cars and from cars, we're not doing it for the last year or so. So we know this, it's not something inbred in them that they feel they need to go out and do. What we've got to do is fill their time with more positive things so as they can live a better lifestyle, so as they can live a better life, and at the same time, what's a lifestyle that they want to surround themselves with. And not an easy one, because crime, I'm going to beat this drum again, is primarily driven by poverty and a lack of opportunity. So that's what we should be addressing. But at the same time, I understand that the police have got a job to do.
Exactly. Well, sadly, that is all we have time for this evening. So thanks again to Siobhan and Ronnie. It was great having you both on the show. And thanks to you at home for watching too. If you would like to support the work we do at Broadcasting Scotland, then please consider signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. You can find the link to sign up on your screen just now. And thanks again for watching.